In the vastness of space, where 1,000 alien civilizations have risen and fallen, there exists one universal truth that every species learns. Silence is the prelude to extinction. The Galactic Council has witnessed empires crumble with thunderous roars, species vanish in desperate screams, and entire star systems die in brilliant explosions of defiance. But humanity is different. When pushed to their breaking point, when their backs are against the wall and death seems certain, humans don't scream, they don't roar, they don't rage against the dying of the light. They go silent. And in that terrible, absolute silence, something ancient and primal awakens within them. Something that turns ordinary men and women into forces of nature. Something that makes hardened alien warriors whisper prayers to forgotten gods and causes even the most advanced AI systems to recalculate their threat assessments. The Council has a saying now, passed down through classified channels and spoken only in the deepest vaults of their most secure facilities. When humans fall silent in war, count your days in heartbeats, for they have already begun counting yours. This is the story of why they learned to fear that silence. This is the story of what happens when humanity stops talking and starts becoming something else entirely. This is the story of the Quiet War. Commander Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Defiant, watching through the viewport as the Zephyrian fleet assembled in perfect formation. 300 ships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, their hulls gleaming with the distinctive blue-silver alloy that marked the Council's most elite forces. The sight should have been terrifying. 6 months ago, it would have sent her crew into a panic. Now it barely registered as noteworthy. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Rodriguez called from the communications station, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Admiral Thexvar is hailing us. Same demands as before." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She studied the tactical display, noting the positioning of each enemy vessel, calculating firing angles and escape routes with the kind of cold precision that had become second nature over the past year. The Zephyrians had arranged themselves in the Claw of Dominion formation, a classic Council intimidation tactic designed to demonstrate overwhelming superiority while offering the enemy one last chance to surrender. It might have worked against any other species. "Put him through," she said finally, her voice carrying none of the emotion that had colored her words during their first encounter with the Zephyrian forces. No anger, no defiance, just emptiness. The main screen flickered to life, revealing Admiral Thexvar's imposing form. Even by Zephyrian standards, he was massive, his chitinous exoskeleton scarred from a dozen campaigns across the galaxy. His 4 eyes, each capable of tracking independent targets, focused on Sarah with what his species considered barely restrained mercy. "Commander Chen," he began, his translator rendering his clicks and hisses into perfect standard English. "I offer you this final opportunity to withdraw from Kepler 442b and surrender your colonial fleet. The Galactic Council has voted. This system belongs to the hegemony now. Your people need not die for a few rocks and some toxic air." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Around her, the bridge crew continued their duties with mechanical efficiency. No one spoke. No one gasped or cursed or showed any of the normal human reactions to facing impossible odds. The change had been gradual, she reflected, but unmistakable. Over the months of running battles, narrow escapes, and Pyrrhic victories, something fundamental had shifted within her people. They had stopped expecting to live. "Admiral," she said, her tone conversational, almost friendly, "how many human colonies have you pacified since the Council declared us an unregistered species?" Thexvar's mandibles clicked in what might have been surprise. This wasn't the response he'd expected. 17 colonial worlds have been brought into proper alignment with galactic law. Their populations have been relocated to appropriate reserves where they can live in peace under Council protection. "Relocated?" Sarah nodded slowly. "That's a pleasant word for it. My daughter lived on Harmony Station before your forces brought it into proper alignment. She was 8 years old." The Admiral's posture shifted slightly, a subtle change that suggested discomfort. The Zephyrians were warriors, but they weren't monsters. They took no pleasure in the death of younglings, regardless of species. Regrettable casualties are always minimized during pacification operations. The Council's procedures are. "She didn't die in the fighting," Sarah interrupted, her voice still perfectly calm. "She survived the initial assault, made it to the evacuation ships with her mother and about 3,000 other civilians, But those ships were too slow, weren't they? And your orders were clear about preventing any unauthorized departures from Council space. Thexvar said nothing, but his secondary eyes had begun to dart around the edges of the screen, a telling sign of Zephyrian distress. The rescue pods were jettisoned before your forces opened fire, Sarah continued. Standard procedure when facing impossible odds. Give the children a chance. But space is big, Admiral, and rescue pods aren't built for long-term survival. Do you know how long the emergency oxygen lasts in a standard civilian pod? Commander, I do not see the purpose of this discussion. The past cannot be changed. I offer you a chance to prevent further loss of life. Accept the Council's authority and— 72 hours, Sarah said, as if he hadn't spoken. That's how long the oxygen lasts. My daughter spent her last 3 days floating in the dark between stars, probably watching the lights on her pod's control panel go out one by one as the systems failed. She was very smart for her age. She would have understood what was happening. The bridge had grown completely quiet now. Even the soft hum of the life support system seemed muted, as if the ship itself was listening to this conversation. Lieutenant Rodriguez had stopped pretending to monitor his console and was staring at the deck plating with hollow eyes. He'd lost family on Harmony Station, too. They all had lost someone, somewhere along the line. The loss of innocence is always tragic, Thexvar said finally, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. But the greater good demands. The greater good, Sarah repeated. She turned away from the screen and walked to her command chair, settling into it with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it really mattered. Tell me, Admiral, in all your campaigns against unregistered species, how many times has the greater good required the extinction of children? The Terran colonial expansion was illegal under galactic law. The Council cannot permit. My daughter's name was Emily, Sarah said, cutting him off again. She wanted to be a xenobiologist when she grew up. She collected pictures of different alien species and would spend hours imagining what their homeworlds looked like. She was particularly fascinated by Zephyrian hive structures. Did you know that? Thexvar's 4 eyes had stopped their restless movement and were now fixed on Sarah with an intensity that suggested he was beginning to understand that something had fundamentally changed in this conversation. She would have loved to meet you under different circumstances, Sarah continued. Would have asked you 1,000 questions about your people, your culture, your art. She believed that understanding between species was not only possible but inevitable. She had such faith in the basic goodness of sapient beings. The Admiral opened his mandibles to speak, but Sarah raised a hand to stop him. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, she said. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what you've accomplished here. You haven't just conquered human colonies, Admiral. You haven't just eliminated a potential rival to Council authority. You've done something much more significant than that. She leaned forward slightly, and for the first time since the communication had begun, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, not hatred. Something colder and infinitely more dangerous. You've shown us what we really are. Thexvar's translator struggled with the next few seconds of silence, processing ambient sounds and finding nothing to convert. The Admiral himself had gone completely still, his warrior's instincts recognizing a threat even when his conscious mind couldn't identify its nature. For 3 centuries, Sarah said, humanity expanded into the galaxy with hope. We built colonies not just to claim territory, but to create homes. We established trade routes not just for profit, but to build relationships. We sent out exploration fleets not just to map the stars, but to find friends among them. We believed that our children would inherit a galaxy full of wonders and allies. She gestured toward the tactical display, where the human fleet's pathetic 47 ships faced off against the Council's overwhelming force. Look around, Admiral. Do you see any children on these ships, any families, any civilians at all? Thexvar followed her gesture, and his auxiliary eyes began that nervous darting motion again. He was beginning to realize something that the Council's intelligence reports had somehow missed. The human ships were all military vessels, every single one. No colony ships, no transports, no civilian auxiliaries. Just warships, crewed by people who had nothing left to lose. The children are gone, Sarah said softly. The families are gone, the civilians are gone, the dreamers and the builders and the poets are all gone. Do you know what that leaves, Admiral? The communication channel carried only silence for several long moments. It leaves us, Sarah said finally. And we've learned something interesting about ourselves during these past months of running and fighting and dying, something that even we didn't fully understand before you started hunting us. She stood up from her command chair and walked closer to the screen, until her face filled most of the Admiral's view. We're very good at killing, Admiral, remarkably good. It turns out that when you strip away everything that makes us civilized, our hopes, our dreams, our loved ones, our future, what remains is something that your council has never encountered before. Something that doesn't appear in any of your xenopsychological profiles or threat assessments. Thexvar found his voice at last. What are you saying? Sarah smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression that the Admiral had ever seen on any face, human or otherwise. It was empty of everything except a kind of Arctic inevitability. I'm saying that the war you thought you were fighting is over, Admiral. You won. Humanity, as a civilized species, has been effectively eliminated. Our children are dead. Our colonies are dust. Our dreams of a peaceful future among the stars have been burned to ash. She paused, letting that sink in. But you made one critical error in your calculations. You assumed that when you destroyed everything that made us human, you would be left with nothing to fight. Instead, you've created something that your council has never had to face before. You've made a species with nothing left to lose and a very particular set of skills. The bridge around her had gone so quiet that the Admiral could hear individual crew members breathing through the comm channel. We don't want your surrender, Sarah said. We don't want your territory, we don't want your resources or your technology or your alliance. We want something much simpler than that. What? Thexvar whispered. Sarah's smile widened, becoming something that belonged on a predator's face rather than a starship commander's. We want to know how many of you we can take with us before the last human ship goes dark. She gestured to Lieutenant Rodriguez, who cut the communication without ceremony. The main screen went blank, leaving the bridge in the kind of absolute silence that had become humanity's signature in this war. Around the ship, similar conversations were taking place on every vessel in the human fleet. Not strategies or battle plans or inspiring speeches about victory and glory. Just quiet, methodical discussions about target priorities and ammunition reserves and how to maximize damage before the inevitable end. Sarah returned to her command chair and accessed her personal logs one final time. She scrolled through months of after-action reports, casualty lists, and tactical analyses, looking for the exact moment when her people had stopped fighting to win and started fighting to make the enemy remember them. She found it in the logs from the Battle of Wolf's Crossing, 6 weeks after Harmony Station. The entry was brief. Enemy forces withdrew after suffering 37% casualties. We lost everything, transitioning to Protocol 7. Protocol 7. The contingency that command had developed in the early days of the war, when it became clear that conventional victory was impossible. The protocol that transformed a military force into something else entirely. Something that fought not for territory or resources or political objectives, but for the simple purpose of inflicting maximum pain on the enemy before dying. It had taken time for the full transformation to occur. Soldiers had to learn to stop thinking about home because home no longer existed. Officers had to learn to stop planning for the future because there was no future to plan for. Everyone had to learn to stop hopping because hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. But the process was complete now. Looking around her bridge at the faces of her crew, Sarah could see it in their eyes. The empty calm of people who had accepted their fate and found a kind of peace in that acceptance. They would fight with perfect efficiency, take calculated risks that no sane person would consider, and die without complaint when their time came. The Zephyrians were about to learn why every predator species in the galaxy's history had evolved to fear wounded prey that had stopped trying to escape. Sarah opened a ship-wide channel and spoke into the comm system, her voice reaching every human vessel in the fleet. All ships, this is Commander Chen. We've made our position clear to the enemy. They have 300 ships, we have 47. The mathematics are simple. She paused, listening to the perfect silence that greeted her words. Begin the hunt. Around the human fleet, weapon systems came online with mechanical precision. No one cheered. No one gave inspiring speeches about duty or honor or sacrifice. They simply began the process of translating their fleet's collective death wish into maximum enemy casualties. In the Zephyrian formation, Admiral Thexvar stared at his sensor readings in growing alarm. The human ships weren't behaving like any military force he'd encountered in 2 centuries of warfare. They weren't maneuvering for tactical advantage or attempting to minimize their exposure to enemy fire. Instead, they were moving with the calculated precision of hunting predators, positioning themselves to maximize the damage they could inflict before being destroyed. He opened a channel to his fleet commanders and found himself speaking the words that would later become part of Galactic Council military doctrine. All ships maintain maximum alert status. The enemy has transitioned to terminal warfare protocols. They are no longer fighting to win. Repeat, they are no longer fighting to win. Behind him, his tactical officer looked up from his console with confusion evident in his body language. "Sir, what does that mean?" Thexvar watched as the human ships completed their approach, moving with the kind of fearless precision that only came from having absolutely nothing left to lose. "It means," he said quietly, "that we are about to learn why the ancient texts warn against cornering prey that has stopped trying to live." The battle was about to begin, and for the first time in his long military career, Admiral Thexvar found himself wondering if victory was worth the price they were about to pay for it. The first human ship died exactly 17 minutes after the battle began. The UES Retribution, a heavy cruiser that had once carried colonists to New Geneva, simply sailed directly into the center of the Zephyrian formation and detonated its reactor core. The explosion vaporized 2 enemy destroyers and crippled a battlecruiser, but that wasn't the part that sent ripples of unease through the alien fleet. What disturbed the Zephyrian crews was how the Retribution had died. No distress calls, no attempts to escape when their shields failed. No final words or curses or prayers. Just silence, followed by a precisely calculated detonation that maximized enemy casualties. Admiral Thexvar watched his tactical display update with the new casualty figures and felt something he hadn't experienced since his first battle decades ago: uncertainty. The humans were fighting like no species he'd ever encountered. They showed no self-preservation instinct, no tactical flexibility, no concern for their own survival. They simply identified the most efficient way to damage his forces and executed those plans with mechanical precision. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "the humans are broadcasting something on all frequencies." "Put it through," Thexvar ordered, expecting some form of surrender or final defiance. What came through the speakers was even more unsettling than silence. It was music, soft, melancholic, and utterly human in its emotional complexity. A piece called Sorrow's End that had been composed on one of the destroyed colonies. The melody drifted through space between the warring fleets, serving no tactical purpose except to remind everyone listening that real people had once lived on those dead worlds. "Why are they playing music during combat?" asked his tactical officer. Thexvar didn't have an answer. Nothing in his military training had prepared him for an enemy that conducted warfare while broadcasting funeral hymns. 3 more human ships died in the next hour, each death carefully orchestrated to inflict maximum damage on his forces. The UES Vengeance rammed a Zephyrian dreadnought at full speed, its reinforced bow punching through armor plating and destroying the enemy ship's power core. The UES Memory's End used its last torpedo spread to collapse an enemy cruiser's structural integrity, then used its own hull as a kinetic projectile to finish the job. The UES Final Dawn simply flew straight at the enemy formation's command ship, absorbing incredible amounts of fire before delivering a spread of antimatter missiles at point-blank range. Each attack was perfectly executed. Each death served a specific tactical purpose, and each human crew met their fate in complete silence. By contrast, Thexvar's own forces were becoming increasingly vocal. The normal chatter of military communications had given way to nervous reports, confused questions, and the kind of subvocal prayers that soldiers offered when facing something beyond their understanding. His crews were experienced veterans who had fought against dozens of species across the galaxy, but they had never faced an enemy that treated death as merely another tactical option. "Admiral," his sensor operator called out, "we're detecting unusual energy signatures from the remaining human vessels." "Specify." "They appear to be overloading their power cores, sir. All of them." Thexvar felt his blood temperature drop. Overloading power cores was typically a last resort, used when a ship was already dying and the crew wanted to take enemies with them. But the remaining human vessels weren't damaged beyond repair. They were preparing for synchronized mass suicide. All ships emergency scatter protocol, he ordered. Maximum dispersal, prepare for multiple reactor detonations. But the humans weren't finished with their psychological warfare. Instead of immediately detonating their ships, they began broadcasting something else. This time it wasn't music. It was children's voices. The transmission came from the UES Defiant, and it carried the recorded voices of young humans singing a simple song about starlight and dreams. The recording was from a school performance on Harmony Station, captured just weeks before the Zephyrian assault that had destroyed the colony. The innocent voices drifted through space between the fleets, a reminder of exactly what the Council's pacification campaigns had accomplished. Even through his translator, Thexvar could hear the pure hope in those young voices. They sang about exploring the stars and making friends with alien species and building a future full of wonder and discovery. They sang with the absolute certainty that the universe was fundamentally good and that tomorrow would be better than today. They had been wrong, of course. Tomorrow had brought fire and death and the cold mathematics of interstellar warfare. But their voices lingered in the silence between explosions, a ghostly reminder of possibilities that would never be realized. "Sir," his tactical officer said quietly, "the humans are requesting communication." Thexvar almost refused. These psychological tactics were more effective than any weapon the humans possessed, but military protocol demanded that he listen to enemy communications. Put them through. Commander Chen's face appeared on his screen again, but something had changed. She looked older somehow, as if the past few hours had aged her years. Behind her, the bridge of the Defiant showed clear signs of battle damage, but her crew continued working with the same silent efficiency they had displayed throughout the engagement. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying that same terrible calm, "I wanted to thank you." The statement was so unexpected that Thexvar found himself responding without thinking. "Thank me." "For showing us who we really are," Chen explained. "For all our history, humans have wondered about our place in the universe. We've debated whether we were fundamentally good or evil, whether we were capable of transcending our animal nature, whether we could build something better than the wars and hatred that marked our early development." She gestured toward her ruined bridge, where Lieutenant Rodriguez lay slumped over his console, his life's blood slowly pooling on the deck plating. "You've answered those questions for us. We tried to be better. We tried to build something beautiful among the stars. We tried to raise our children to believe in cooperation and understanding and peace." The children's voices continued singing in the background, their innocent melody weaving through the communication like an accusation. "But when push came to shove," Chen continued, "when everything we built was threatened, we didn't become saints or philosophers or enlightened beings. We became exactly what evolution designed us to be. We became killers, the best killers this galaxy has ever produced." Thexvar realized that his mandibles were clicking rapidly, a sign of extreme stress among his people. "Commander, you still have time to surrender. The Council is not unreasonable. Terms can be arranged." "Terms?" Chen laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Admiral, you still don't understand. We're not fighting for terms. We're not fighting for our lives. We're not even fighting for revenge exactly." She leaned forward, and her eyes held the same empty intensity that had disturbed him during their first conversation. "We're fighting to make sure that every species in the galaxy remembers what happened here. We're fighting to ensure that the story of humanity's extinction becomes a cautionary tale that haunts Council proceedings for the next 1,000 years." The transmission flickered as another explosion rocked the Defiant, but Chen's image remained stable. "Every ship you lose here will be remembered. Every crew member who dies will have their name recorded in our final transmissions. When the last human vessel goes dark, we're going to broadcast the complete casualty list to every inhabited system in the galaxy. The Council will have to explain to their citizens exactly how many of their sons and daughters it cost to eliminate a species whose only crime was dreaming of a better future." Thexvar felt something he had never experienced in his long military career, the desire to retreat from a battle his forces were clearly winning. "You see, Admiral," Chen continued, "the Council made a critical error when they decided to exterminate us. They assumed that destroying our colonies and killing our children would break our spirit. Instead, it freed us from the only thing that ever constrained our potential for destruction, the desire to build something worth preserving." The children's song was ending now, their voices fading into silence as the recording reached its conclusion. In the quiet that followed, Chen's words carried with crystal clarity. We have 43 ships left. You have 271. The mathematics suggest that you'll win this engagement. But I want you to consider something. How many of your ships are you willing to trade for the complete elimination of the human threat? How many Zephyrian families are you prepared to destroy to finish what you started? She paused, letting the question hang in the silence. Because I can guarantee you this. We will make you pay for every single light year between here and our last ship. We will turn this war into the most expensive victory in the Council's history. And when it's over, when the last human has died and our species is nothing but a footnote in your historical records, every military commander in the galaxy will know exactly what it costs to drive a sapient species to extinction. Thexvar found himself staring at casualty projections that made his stomachs clench. His tactical computers were running scenarios based on the humans' current behavior patterns, and the results were deeply disturbing. If the remaining human ships continued their current tactics, his fleet would suffer casualties approaching 60%. A technical victory, but at a cost that would cripple the Zephyrian military for decades. There has to be another way, he said finally. Chen shook her head slowly. You made that decision for us 6 months ago, Admiral. When you destroyed our first colony, you started a process that can only end one way. The only choice you have now is how much you're willing to pay to see it through to completion. She gestured to someone off-screen, and Thexvar could hear the distinctive whine of human weapons charging to full power. We're transmitting our final message now, Chen said. Every human ship is broadcasting on all frequencies, sending out a complete record of this conflict. The locations of every destroyed colony, the names of every killed civilian, the tactical reports from every engagement, all of it. Thexvar's communications officer was already confirming the transmission, his body language indicating extreme alarm. Sir, they're using quantum entanglement communicators. The signal is reaching inhabited systems across the galaxy in real time. Why? Thexvar asked. Chen's smile held no warmth whatsoever. Because we want every species in the galaxy to understand exactly what the Council's idea of pacification really means. We want them to know that when the Council decides your people are inconvenient, this is what happens. Total war, complete extinction. No mercy for children or civilians or anyone who gets in the way. The transmission cut out suddenly as another explosion rocked the Defiant. When the image stabilized, Thexvar could see that half of Chen's bridge crew were dead or dying, but she remained at her post with the same mechanical calm that had characterized human behavior throughout this engagement. We're going to make sure, she said, her voice now distorted by damage to the ship's communication systems, that every species in the galaxy knows the price of crossing the Council. And more importantly, we're going to make sure they know the price the Council is willing to pay to maintain their authority. Around the human fleet, the remaining ships had formed into a perfect sphere, their weapons pointed outward in all directions. They weren't trying to escape or maneuver for tactical advantage. They were simply preparing to die as expensively as possible. Final warning, Admiral, Chen said. You can still withdraw. You can report to the Council that the human threat has been neutralized and that further engagement is unnecessary. Your forces have accomplished their primary objective. Continued fighting serves no strategic purpose. Thexvar considered the option for exactly 3 seconds before discarding it. The Council's orders had been explicit, complete elimination of the human threat. No survivors, no exceptions, no half-measures. To withdraw now would mean court-martial and execution, regardless of the casualties his fleet had already suffered. I have my orders, he said finally. Chen nodded as if she had expected that response. Then we'll see you in hell, Admiral. The transmission ended, and the human sphere began to contract. Not retreating, but condensing into a formation that would maximize the damage they could inflict before dying. Each ship was now a guided missile with a crew willing to die to ensure it reached its target. Thexvar opened a fleet-wide channel and spoke the words that would later be recorded in military academies across the galaxy as an example of Pyrrhic victory. All ships prepare for terminal engagement. The enemy has committed to total warfare. Expect heavy casualties. He closed the channel and stared at his tactical display, watching as 43 human ships prepared to teach the galaxy exactly why exterminating a sapient species was a luxury that no one could afford. The mathematics were simple. The cost would be anything but. The battle lasted 6 hours and 14 minutes. When it was over, Admiral Thexvar found himself staring at damage reports that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Of his original 300 ships, only 87 remained combat effective. 146 ships had been completely destroyed. 67 more were so heavily damaged that they would never fly again. The human fleet, by contrast, had been utterly annihilated. Not a single human vessel remained intact. By every military standard, the engagement had been a decisive council victory. By every practical measure, it had been a catastrophe. Thexvar stood in what remained of his flagship's command center, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been the most advanced military force the Zephyrian hegemony had ever assembled. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow, and the constant background noise of repair crews and medical personnel created a soundtrack of barely contained chaos. "Sir," his communications officer called out, his voice strained with exhaustion and trauma, "we're receiving priority transmissions from Zephyrian High Command. They're demanding an explanation for our casualty rates." Thexvar almost laughed. An explanation, as if there were words in any language that could adequately describe what had happened here. How could he explain that the humans had fought like no species in galactic history? How could he convey that they had turned their own deaths into weapons more effective than any technology the Council possessed? "Tell High Command that the human threat has been eliminated," he said finally. "All enemy vessels destroyed, mission accomplished." The communications officer hesitated. "Sir, they're also asking about the broadcasts. The human transmissions reached every major population center in the galaxy. There are already reports of civilian unrest on 17 Council worlds." Of course there were. Had monitored those transmissions himself during the final hour of the battle. The humans had been thorough in their final act of defiance. They had transmitted not just battle records and casualty lists, but personal messages from the dead. Final words from colonial administrators. Last letters from parents to children. Recordings from schools and hospitals and research stations, all captured in the moments before Zephyrian forces had pacified those worlds. The galaxy now knew exactly what Council pacification meant. They had heard the voices of children crying for their parents. They had seen the footage of families separated during relocation procedures. They had watched recordings of human civilians dying not in combat, but in the sterile efficiency of Council processing centers. Worst of all, they had seen the transformation. The broadcasts had included before and after recordings that showed how ordinary humans had been changed by the systematic destruction of everything they cared about. The early transmissions showed people fighting for their homes, their families, their dreams of a peaceful future among the stars. The later recordings showed something else entirely, perfectly efficient killing machines that had learned to weaponize their own mortality. "The broadcasts are not our concern," Thexvar said, though he knew that wasn't true. Those transmissions would reshape galactic politics for decades to come. "Our mission was to eliminate the human military threat. That objective has been achieved." But even as he spoke the words, Thexvar knew that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. The humans were gone, yes, but their final message was spreading through inhabited space like a virus, carrying with it a question that every sapient species would now have to answer. If the Council could do this to humanity, what was to stop them from doing the same to anyone else who became inconvenient? "Sir," the tactical officer said quietly, "we're detecting new contacts on long-range sensors." Thexvar felt a moment of absurd hope. Perhaps some human ships had survived, hidden in the system's outer asteroid belt or behind the gas giant's rings. It would mean that his mission was not yet complete, but it would also mean that he wouldn't have to return to Zephyrian space carrying the bodies of 2/3 of his fleet. "Identify," he ordered. "Multiple fleets, sir. I'm reading Altarian signatures, vegan Confederacy markers, and, sir, those look like Andromedian war forms." Thexvar's secondary hearts began to race. The species his officer had just named represented some of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. More importantly, they were all Council member states whose loyalty had been considered absolute for centuries. "Are they responding to our distress signals?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Negative, sir. They're maintaining standard formation spacing and—" The officer paused, his voice becoming strained. "Sir, they're not broadcasting Council identification codes. Their military transponders are active, but they're not identifying as Council forces. The implications hit Thexvar like a physical blow. The human broadcasts hadn't just been propaganda or a final act of defiance. They had been a catalyst, a spark that had ignited something that the Council's intelligence services had failed to detect. Growing dissatisfaction among the member species about the hegemony's increasingly aggressive expansion policies. How many ships? Thexvar asked. Initial count suggests approximately 1,500 vessels, sir. More are entering sensor range every few minutes. 1,500 ships, against his remaining 87 combat-effective vessels. The mathematics were even worse than what he had faced against the humans, but with one critical difference. These were fresh crews with full ammunition supplies and undamaged ships. His own forces were exhausted, traumatized, and running low on everything from missiles to medical supplies. Are they responding to hails? Yes, sir. Admiral Cathara of the Altarian fleet is requesting communication. Admiral Cathara. Thexvar knew that name. She was a legend among Altarian naval officers, a tactical genius who had never lost a fleet engagement in 30 years of service. She was also, according to intelligence reports, someone who had grown increasingly critical of Council policies toward non-member species. Put her through, Thexvar said. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the distinctive crystalline features of an Altarian military commander. Admiral Cathara's species communicated as much through light patterns in their translucent skin as through vocalizations, and the colors currently flowing across her face suggested controlled anger and deep disappointment. Admiral Thexvar, she said, her translator rendering her harmonic tones into flat standard. We have monitored the recent engagement in this system. We have also received and analyzed the human transmissions. Thexvar tried to summon the authority that had served him throughout his career, but something in Cathara's manner suggested that the old protocols no longer applied. Admiral Cathara, I am operating under direct orders from the Galactic Council. The hegemony has voted to classify this system as strategically important to Council interests. Any interference with our operations constitutes a violation of. The Altarian Republic formally withdraws from the Galactic Council, effective immediately, Cathara interrupted, her skin patterns shifting to colors that Thexvar's translator couldn't interpret. We are transmitting our official notice of separation to all Council worlds as we speak. The words hit Thexvar like a physical blow. The Altarian Republic was one of the Council's founding members. Their withdrawal would trigger political earthquakes that would reshape the entire galactic balance of power. You can't be serious, he said. The Altarian Republic has been part of the Council for 8 centuries. You've benefited from Council trade agreements, military protection, technological exchange. We have also been complicit in the systematic extermination of 17 sapient species, Cathara replied, her colors now definitely indicating disgust. The human broadcasts included detailed records of every Council pacification operation over the past 2 decades. Did you know that the average civilian casualty rate during these operations is 93%? Thexvar had not known that, and he suspected that most Council military commanders didn't know it either. Such statistics were classified above his clearance level. Those operations were necessary to maintain galactic stability, he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The species targeted for pacification had all violated Council expansion protocols or posed threats to established trade routes. The humans violated expansion protocols by claiming systems that the Council had not yet surveyed, Cathara said. Their threat to established trade routes consisted of offering better prices for rare minerals. Their military posed no danger to any established civilization. She paused, and her skin patterns shifted to something that looked like deep sadness. We have spent the past 6 hours reviewing the complete human historical database that was included in their final transmissions. Do you know what we found, Admiral? Thexvar said nothing. We found a species that spent 3 centuries trying to become worthy of joining the galactic community. They studied our cultures, learned our languages, adopted our ethical frameworks. They banned weapons of mass destruction from their colonial ships. They established first contact protocols that prioritized peaceful communication over territorial claims. They taught their children to see diversity as a strength rather than a threat. The colors in her skin were becoming more intense, and Thexvar's translator was struggling to keep up with the emotional complexity of her communication. They did everything right, Admiral. They became exactly the kind of species that the Council claims to want as members. And when they applied for provisional membership, they were told that their application was under review and would be processed in due course. That was 47 years ago. Thexvar felt something cold forming in his stomach. I was not aware of any membership application. Of course you weren't, because the Council never intended to consider it seriously. Humans were useful as an external threat, something to point to when member species started asking questions about expansion policies or military budgets. As long as there were dangerous unregistered species out there, the member worlds would continue to support increased Council authority and military spending. The truth of her words hit him like a missile impact. He thought about the briefings he had received before this mission, the emphasis on human aggression and unpredictability. He thought about the intelligence reports that had painted them as a species barely contained by their own primitive social structures. None of those reports had mentioned membership applications or peaceful contact attempts or the systematic Council policy of treating human diplomatic overtures as security threats. The Vegan Confederacy is also withdrawing from the Council, Cathara continued, as are the Andromedan clusters and the Helix Nebula Coalition. We are forming a new alliance, one dedicated to the principle that sapient species have the right to exist without Council permission. 1,500 ships. Thexvar could now see them on his tactical display, representing the combined military might of 4 of the Council's most powerful member states. Even at full strength, his fleet couldn't have faced such a force. In his current condition, resistance would be suicide. But there was something else in Cathara's words that disturbed him even more than the military situation. You said you're forming a new alliance, he said carefully. May I ask what you intend to call it? Cathara's skin patterns shifted to something that might have been pride mixed with sorrow. The Human Federation, she said simply, in honor of the species that showed us what the cost of silence really is. The words carried a weight that transcended their simple meaning. The humans were gone, extinct down to the last child, but their final act had accomplished something that their 3 centuries of peaceful diplomacy could not. They had shown the galaxy exactly what the Council's version of order really meant, and they had done it in a way that no one could ignore or rationalize away. Admiral Thexvar, Cathara continued, you and your remaining ships are free to return to Council space. We have no quarrel with you personally. You are following orders just as we have all followed orders for far too long. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a sadness that the translator couldn't fully capture. But understand this, the galaxy has changed. The human broadcasts have reached every inhabited system. Every species now knows what happens when you become inconvenient to Council interests. The age of unquestioned Council authority is over. The transmission ended, leaving Thexvar alone with his thoughts and his damaged fleet. Around him, the wreckage of human ships drifted in the void, silent monuments to a species that had learned to turn their own extinction into a weapon more powerful than any technology the galaxy had ever seen. He thought about Commander Chen and her terrible calm. He thought about the children's voices singing about starlight and dreams. He thought about the 47 ships that had faced his 300 and somehow managed to win a victory that transcended the simple mathematics of military engagement. The humans were gone, but they had left behind something more dangerous than any living enemy, a question that every sapient being in the galaxy would now have to answer. If the Council could exterminate an entire species for the crime of wanting to join the galactic community, what did that say about the civilization they claimed to represent? Sir, his communications officer said quietly, we're receiving new transmissions from the breakaway fleets. They're broadcasting the human records on all frequencies, ensuring maximum distribution throughout Council space. Thexvar nodded absently. Of course they were. The humans had provided them with the perfect weapon against Council authority. The truth, every family separated during relocation procedures, every civilian killed in pacification operations, every species driven to extinction for the crime of being inconvenient. The Council had spent centuries building their authority on the premise that they brought order and stability to a chaotic galaxy. The humans had proven that premise false with their final transmissions, and now every species that had ever chafed under Council rule had the evidence they needed to justify rebellion. Set course for Zephyrian space, Thexvar ordered. Best possible speed. As his damaged fleet limped away from the battlefield, Thexvar composed his after-action report. It would be a masterpiece of military understatement. Mission accomplished. Human threat eliminated. Fleet sustained heavy casualties during final engagement. Recommend immediate review of pacification protocols. He wouldn't mention the breakaway fleets or the formation of the Human Federation. Those would be someone else's problem to report. He wouldn't discuss the political implications of the human broadcasts or the growing unrest on Council worlds. His mission had been narrow and specific: eliminate the human military threat. He had accomplished that mission. The humans were gone, extinct down to the last child. But as his ships jumped to hyperspace, carrying with them the news that would reshape galactic civilization, Thexvar found himself wondering if victory was supposed to feel this much like defeat. Behind them, the wreckage of the human fleet continued its eternal drift through the void. Silent, empty, victorious. The galaxy would remember what happened here. Every species would know the price of crossing the Council, and the price the Council was willing to pay to maintain their authority. The age of unquestioned obedience was ending, replaced by something that the humans had bought with their blood: the knowledge that some things were worth dying for and some victories were worth any cost. In the growing rebellion that would follow, in the new alliances that would form from the ashes of Council authority, in the questions that would challenge every assumption about power and justice and the right of the strong to rule the weak, the humans would live on. Not as individuals or as a species, but as an idea that could not be killed by any weapon the galaxy possessed. The idea that silence, when chosen at the right moment and for the right reasons, could be more powerful than any scream. The idea that some things were worth the ultimate price. The idea that even in death, the smallest voice could change everything. The Human Federation was born from that silence, and it would carry that lesson forward into whatever future the galaxy would build from the ruins of the old order. The humans were gone, but their final message would echo through the stars for as long as sapient beings remembered what it meant to choose hope over survival, justice over safety, and truth over comfortable lies. They had gone silent in war, and in that silence they had found their voice at last.